My name is Jake Lamar, and I'm going to read from Richard Wright's Black Boy. Richard Wright was born in 1908 into a poor black family in Mississippi. Eventually, he made his way north, first to Chicago, then to New York. And in 1940, at the age of 32, he published the novel Native Son, which was a phenomenon. It was a fierce indictment of racism in America, and it made Wright the most famous, critically acclaimed, and commercially successful African-American writer in history up to that point. 5 years later, he brought out Black Boy, his memoir of growing up in the Deep South, and it made as much of an impact as Native Son. Soon after World War II ended, Wright found, despite his wealth and his fame, the daily grind of racism in America, even in sophisticated New York, he just found it unbearable, and finally moved with his family to Paris, where he would live for the rest of his life until 1960, when he died an untimely death at the age of 52. Wright was a major figure in the international literary community in Paris, and a major figure in the American community here. He was also a good friend of the American Library. So I thought this would be a great choice, a selection from Richard Wright to read for the library's centennial celebration. When it comes to my own life, Wright is just about the most influential writer I've read. I first read Black Boy when I was 12 years old, and it was one of the books that made me want to be a writer myself. His coming to Paris was an inspiration to me. After I published my first book, I came to Paris, arriving in 1993. That first weekend, I went to Père Lachaise to visit Wright's final resting place in that famous cemetery. I also found his apartment, the building where he lived in the 6th arrondissement, and saw the plaque there commemorating the years he lived in that building. I went to one of his old haunts, the Café Tournon. I think I half expected to see Richard Wright sitting there. Alas, he wasn't there. And I've gone on to make a life as a writer for myself here in Paris. I, too, am a good friend of the American Library. And the passage I'm going to read from Black Boy, this takes place when Richard Wright is 19 years old. He's living in Memphis, Tennessee, working as a so-called office boy or errand boy in an office largely populated by older white men. And as you'll see in this passage, libraries had a special significance for someone in Richard Wright's position back in those days. There was a huge library near the riverfront, but I knew that Negroes were not allowed to patronize its shelves any more than they were the parks and playgrounds of the city. I had gone into the library several times to get books for the white men on the job. Which of them would now help me to get books? And how could I read them without causing concern to the white men with whom I worked? I had so far been successful in hiding my thoughts and feelings from them. But I knew that I would create hostility if I went about this business of reading in a clumsy way. Well, Wright does find a white man who lends him his library card and allows Wright to forge notes for the librarian. I forged more notes, and my trips to the library became frequent. Reading grew into a passion. My first serious novel was Sinclair Lewis's Main Street. It made me see my boss, Mr. Gerald, and identify him as an American type. I would smile when I saw him lugging his golf bags into the office. I had always felt a vast distance separating me from the boss, and now I felt closer to him, though still distant. I felt now that I knew him, that I could feel the very limits of his narrow life. And this had happened because I had read a novel about a mythical man called George F. Babbitt. The plots and stories in the novels did not interest me so much as the point of view revealed. I gave myself over to each novel without reserve, without trying to criticize it. It was enough for me to see and feel something different. And for me, everything was something different. Reading was like a drug, a dope. The novels created moods in which I lived for days. But I could not conquer my sense of guilt, my feeling that the white men around me knew that I was changing, that I had begun to regard them differently. Whenever I brought a book to the job, I wrapped it in newspaper, a habit that was to persist for years in other cities and under other circumstances. But some of the white men pried into my packages when I was absent, and they questioned me. "Boy, what are you reading those books for?" "Oh, I don't know, sir." "That's deep stuff you're reading, boy." "I'm just killing time, sir." "You'll addle your brains if you don't watch out." I read Dreiser's Jenny Gerhardt and Sister Carrie, and they revived in me a sense of my mother's suffering. I was overwhelmed. I grew silent, wondering about the life around me. It would have been impossible for me to have told anyone what I derived from these novels, for it was nothing less than a sense of life itself. All my life had shaped me for the realism, the naturalism of the modern novel, and I could not read enough of them.